Chapter 18. The Return of Extremes. The 84-year historical cycle and the reemergence of global authoritarianism, 1933 to 2017. Introduction. History rarely progresses in a straight line. More often, it unfolds in recurring patterns marked by phases of construction, stability, decay, and rupture. Across civilizations, historians and philosophers have observed that periods of crisis tend to produce radical political responses, frequently in the form of strong leaders who promise order, renewal, and national restoration. From Giambattista Vico's Corsi e Ricorsi to Oswald Spengler's theory of civilizational decline, Arnold Toynbee's challenge and response model, Kondratiev's long economic waves, and Strauss-Howe generational theory, the idea of historical cyclicality has remained a persistent analytical framework. This essay proposes an interpretive model centered on an 84-year historical cycle, highlighting a structural parallel between 1933 and 2017, two moments separated by precisely 8 decades and 4 years, yet strikingly similar in political atmosphere. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, marking the beginning of what can be described as the global era of dictators. In January 2017, Donald Trump assumed the presidency of the United States, signaling a profound disruption of the post-World War II liberal order. The argument presented here is not one of moral equivalence or ideological identity. Rather, it is a comparative structural analysis, examining how similar historical conditions, economic stress, institutional fatigue, cultural polarization, and collective amnesia produce analogous political outcomes across time. The central thesis is that the world has entered a new phase of the same cycle that began in the early 1930s, characterized by the simultaneous rise of extreme right-wing and extreme left-wing leadership across multiple regions. 1933, the birth of the era of dictators. The year 1933 stands as a watershed moment in modern history. It marked the collapse of confidence in liberal democracy across much of Europe and the consolidation of authoritarian regimes that would dominate the following decades. 1. Economic collapse and institutional breakdown. The Great Depression, triggered by the 1929 financial crash, devastated economies worldwide. Industrial output collapsed, unemployment soared, and international trade disintegrated. Liberal democratic institutions, already fragile after World War I, proved incapable of delivering rapid solutions. This failure created fertile ground for political extremism. 2. The extreme right. Adolf Hitler, Germany, appointed chancellor in January 1933, Hitler capitalized on economic despair, national humiliation, and social fragmentation. His regime rapidly dismantled democratic institutions and concentrated power. Benito Mussolini, Italy. Already in power since 1922, Mussolini's fascist model became an ideological reference point for other authoritarian movements. Francisco Franco, Spain. Rising through military revolt, Franco established a long-lasting authoritarian regime after the Spanish Civil War. These leaders shared core characteristics: nationalism, authoritarianism, hostility toward liberal democracy, and the use of mass mobilization. 3. The extreme left. Joseph Stalin, Soviet Union. While ideologically opposed to fascism, Stalin represented an equally extreme form of authoritarianism. His rule was defined by centralized power, political repression, state control of the economy, and a pervasive cult of personality. Crucially, right-wing and left-wing dictatorships emerged simultaneously, responding to the same global crisis but offering radically different ideological solutions. 2. the 84-year cycle as a historical framework. The proposed 84-year cycle corresponds roughly to 3 political generations, approximately 25 to 30 years each. The full lifespan of institutional legitimacy. The transition from lived memory to historical abstraction. After roughly 8 decades, societies tend to lose direct memory of past catastrophes, normalize risks once considered unacceptable, reopen ideological paths previously discredited. Under this model, 1933 marks the beginning of an authoritarian cycle. 1933 plus 84 equals 2017, signaling the start of a new phase. This does not imply determinism, but rather historical susceptibility, a moment when similar conditions reemerge. 2017, the opening of a new cycle. In January 2017, Donald Trump assumed office as President of the United States. His election represented a profound rupture with established political norms, both domestically and internationally. Trump's rise reflected deep distrust of political elites, rejection of globalization, nationalist economic policies, open confrontation with institutions, media, and alliances. As in the 1930s, the phenomenon was not isolated. Trump's presidency coincided with the global resurgence of political extremes. 4. Structural parallels between past and present leaders. 1. Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler. Structural comparison. While operating in radically different systems, both figures exhibit structural similarities. Nationalist rhetoric centered on decline and restoration. Identification of internal and external enemies. Direct appeal to mass sentiment over institutional mediation. Erosion of trust in democratic norms. This comparison concerns political dynamics, not moral equivalence. Hitler reached power in January 1933. 84 years later, in January 2017, Donald Trump reached power in the United States. From this perspective, a new 84-year historical cycle began around January 2017. In 1933, Europe entered what is often described as the era of the dictators, marked by the rise of authoritarian leaders across the ideological spectrum. Extreme right-wing figures such as Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco, and extreme left-wing figures such as Stalin. These leaders emerged in different countries, but within the same historical moment, shaped by crisis, polarization, and institutional breakdown. According to this cyclical interpretation, today we are living in a very similar historical phase. Contemporary political leaders appear to echo earlier figures from the 1930s, not as identical copies, but as modern expressions of comparable political forces. Donald Trump is presented as echoing elements of Hitler's nationalist and authoritarian style within a modern democratic framework. Benjamin Netanyahu is compared to Mussolini, reflecting a form of right-wing nationalism centered on state power and identity. Vladimir Putin is seen as echoing Stalin through centralized authority, repression, and geopolitical expansionism. In Latin America, Andrés Manuel López Obrador is compared to Lázaro Cárdenas, representing a revival of state-centered, nationalist left-wing politics. In Europe, similar polarizations appear. In Spain, Pedro Sánchez represents the contemporary radical or interventionist left. In Italy, Giorgia Meloni represents the modern extreme right. In Latin America more broadly, Javier Milei and Nayib Bukele are associated with new forms of right-wing populism. On the left, figures such as Nicolás Maduro, with power now exercised by Delcy Rodriguez, and Daniel Ortega continue authoritarian socialist traditions. Within this framework, the cycle appears to repeat itself. Moments of global stress give rise simultaneously to strong leaders on both extremes, left and right, across multiple regions. The names, technologies, and institutions change, but the underlying historical pattern remains strikingly similar. 2. Netanyahu and Mussolini. Emphasis on national identity and executive authority. Use of external conflict to consolidate internal power. Framing political opposition as existential threats. 3. Vladimir Putin and Joseph Stalin. Extreme centralization of power. Control of media and institutions. Expansionist geopolitical ambition. Use of historical narrative to legitimize authority. 4. Andrés Manuel López Obrador and Lázaro Cárdenas. State-centered economic nationalism. Populist rhetoric rooted in social justice. Confrontation with economic elites. Reassertion of national sovereignty over markets. V. Europe and Latin America. Symmetrical polarization. Europe. Spain, Pedro Sánchez. Expansion of state intervention, ideological polarization, and erosion of consensus politics. Italy, Giorgia Meloni. Resurgence of nationalist right-wing ideology and skepticism toward supranational governance. Latin America. Right-wing extremes. Javier Milei. Argentina. Nayib Bukele. El Salvador. Strong leadership, anti-institutional discourse. Left-wing extremes. Venezuela. Delcy Rodriguez. Nicaragua. Daniel Ortega. Authoritarian socialism. Institutional control. Repression. As in the 1930s, extremes are increasing, reinforcing polarization. Vi. Shared conditions across both cycles. Several structural conditions unite 1933 and the post-2017 world. Economic inequality and debt expansion. Institutional fatigue and loss of legitimacy. Cultural fragmentation. Technological disruption of information systems. Desire for decisive leadership. These conditions produce a recurring political outcome: the concentration of power and extreme leadership. Conclusion. History does not repeat itself mechanically, but it rhymes with remarkable persistence. The parallel between 1933 and 2017, separated by 84 years, reveals a recurring pattern in which periods of systemic crisis generate authoritarian responses across ideological boundaries. The leaders change, the technologies evolve, and the institutions adapt, but the underlying forces remain constant. Understanding these cycles is not an exercise in fatalism, but a warning. When societies forget the lessons of previous cycles, they risk recreating their most dangerous structures under new names. The recognition of historical cycles offers no prophecy, but foresight, the possibility of awareness, restraint, and ultimately, rupture of repetition. 1. Hitler's tariff actions in 1933. After coming to power in early 1933, Hitler's government did enact higher tariffs and protectionist trade measures as part of an early shift toward economic nationalism and protection of German producers, consistent with Nazi goals of economic self-sufficiency and strengthening domestic industry. This approach fit into a broader pattern of state-directed economic policy aimed ultimately at autarky, economic self-sufficiency, and rearmament, although tariffs were only one piece of the overall program. Key point: Hitler's tariff policies were part of a nationalist economic strategy aimed at protecting domestic producers and reducing reliance on foreign trade, but they were soon integrated into a much larger agenda of state planning and militarization. 2. Trump's tariff actions, first and second term. Broad protectionist shift. Under Donald Trump, tariffs became a central economic tool again. In both his first and second terms, Trump imposed significant tariffs on imported goods, framing them as protection for U.S. industry's jobs and a way to address large trade deficits. In April 2025, for example, Trump introduced a baseline 10% tariff on nearly all imports and higher reciprocal tariffs, up to roughly 50% or more, on goods from countries with which the United States had significant trade deficits. Scale compared to historical averages. These tariff levels raised average U.S. import taxes to their highest levels in over a century, with U.S. effective tariff rates rising markedly compared with recent decades. Even so, the average tariff under Trump generally remained below the extraordinarily high tariff levels seen under older historical protectionist eras, for example, mid-19th century U.S. or the Smoot-Hawley era, though much higher than the post-World War II average. 3. Similarities and differences. Similarities. Nationalistic framing. Both Hitler and Trump used tariffs as part of a broader nationalist economic narrative, protecting domestic industries from foreign competition. Political rationale. Leaders justified tariffs with economic grievances, in Germany as economic self-strengthening and in the U.S. as correcting perceived unfair trade practices and reviving industry. Key differences. Scale and global context. Hitler's Germany was moving toward an autarkic, militarized economy in the context of pre-World War II. Europe, with state planning deeply embedded across the whole economy. Legal and institutional context. Trump's tariff policy operated within a modern global trade system, WTO norms, numerous trade agreements, and was subject to legal challenges domestically and internationally. Economic context. Hitler's tariffs were just one part of a broader radical restructuring of the German economy under Nazi rule. Trump's tariffs are significant within U.S. trade policy, but do not equate to the complete reorganization of the state economy seen in Nazi Germany. Summary. Hitler, 1933. Tariffs were part of early protectionist measures within a larger autarkic and militarized economic strategy. Trump, 2016 to 2025. Tariffs were reviewed as a major tool of U.S. trade policy, raising average tariffs to levels not seen in decades and promoting them as a way to protect U.S. industry and correct trade imbalances, but within a global trade system and modern economic order. Chapter 19. The Returning Hour, on the 84-year cycle and the reappearance of the extremes. Prologue. Of time that does not die. Time does not move forward, it turns. History does not march, it breathes. Empires believe themselves unique. Civilizations believe themselves final, and each generation believes it has escaped the gravity of the past. Yet time remembers what humanity forgets. What is buried is not erased, it waits. There exists a rhythm beneath events, a hidden pulse that governs the rise and fall of orders. When this rhythm completes its arc, the same forces return wearing new names, speaking new languages, wielding new technologies, but animated by the same ancient instincts. This manuscript speaks of that rhythm. It speaks of 84 years. The First Turning, 1933. In January 1933, a door long prepared was finally opened. Adolf Hitler rose to power not as an accident, but as a consequence, the consequence of humiliation, economic collapse, institutional paralysis, and collective despair. Europe, wounded by war and betrayed by its own promises, entered what history would later recognize as the age